because that's what genius is. Genius is this combination of outlier high IQ plus sort of basically moderate autism, which means that they have low impulse control, so they can think outside the box, which normal people can't, and they have relatively low agreeableness, so they either don't care about offending people, which new ideas always do, or they couldn't. But I think with Shockley, he just couldn't anticipate it. He was so naive; it didn't occur to him. And they're all kind of like this in a long line. And James Watson's another example of it. But I think the response to him is less venomous, as it's so clear now that it's accurate what he was arguing. In the good old day, in the 50s maybe, the attitude was that you're an academic, you have a job for life. Most of them will do nothing. Most of them will just sit around, and that's why in those days they had the time to, like Tolkien, to invent languages, or like C.S. Lewis to write children's books, or whatever, because they had all this time to themselves. They had to do a bit of teaching, and that was it. And the hope was that some of them would, and some of them did, like Bertrand Russell or whatever, come up with some genuinely interesting stuff. And those people, the academy has now become bureaucratized. And as far as I can see, I look at this in a book I did some years ago called The Genius Famine with a guy called Bruce Charlton. It's become bureaucratized. The bureaucracy basically breeds more bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is the very enemy of geniuses. Geniuses can't stand bureaucracy. And it becomes based around other factors as well, which are the enemy of genius, such as committees and all this kind of stuff that's come in. And of course, the ideology of political correctness, which people that are autistics can't cope with because it doesn't make any sense. That, this is racist, but not racist if you're white, or not racist if you're black, or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to you. You can't deal with this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think that the academy is basically driving geniuses out. And so there's an environmental level to which, therefore, geniuses won't be reaching their full potential. I mean, that they could have reached if they'd been properly educated. I was born in 1980. And so people who were my generation were caned at public school. And they did seem to have those values, that even in third world countries, once a country industrializes, you get dysgenic fertility. It gets worse the more it industrializes. Once it industrializes, before long, you get this process.
Well, one thing that China, Japan, and Korea have going for them is that not importing vast numbers of low IQ people who breed at astronomical rates compared to the natives.
The fertility of the Danes is something like 1.6 or 7 or something, and the fertility of these immigrants is much higher. It varies according to what kind of immigrant you're talking about, but in the most extreme case, Somalis have an average fertility of 5. So that's obviously going to contribute to this process. But even in the absence of it, we know from Iceland, which we were discussing earlier, and Iceland is still a relatively homogenous population, that even there, definitely IQ is going down. There's definitely dysgenic fertility in Iceland. So even without immigration. But immigration would just make it worse. It was a colleague of mine, actually, called Dimitri van der Linden. And we, at this conference some years ago, we just were talking about these issues and this 2D/4D ratio, for example. Are you familiar with this? So this is the difference between this finger and this finger, and this is a testosterone marker. And on average, if you look at my girly fingers here, that's a bit more manly, but not much hair on the fingers though. That's another marker of testosterone, hair on the fingers, mid-pelagial hair. Yeah, so it's these markers of testosterone. Now, of course, if one of them, we were talking about these, and if one of them is there, well, that doesn't mean very much. But if they all move in the same direction, you see. So if you look at me, you've got these girly hands, you've got a narrow face, that's low testosterone marker, large eyes, that's low testosterone marker, large nose, low testosterone marker, full head of hair at 38. Baldness is a testosterone marker. I mean, if you talk to any doctor, men that come from with impotence age 60 have almost always got full heads of hair. So these we were just talking about this, and we then sort of looked at these 3 people that were talking at another table, and we started sort of judging the kind of characters they'd be based on what they looked like. And then we went over and got chatting to them, and we were astonishingly successful in what we had predicted. And then I found that there's all this research, things that never occurred to me would be correlated or had been looked into, and they go under the radar because it's so kind of non-PC, published in obscure journals, conference proceedings that were never published, published in the 70s and then never thought of again. But I found all this stuff. There's so much of it. And it was every level of it. I mean, even like the one thing that fascinates me is boob size. So the correlation between boob size and the personality of the female, and there really is, and it's in the direction it's what you'd expect it to be. you've got this concept, R and K strategy. So an R strategy is that it's an unstable environment, you live fast and die young. And in that ecology, because you could be knocked out, killed at any second, you therefore invest everything in copulation and in sex and in advertising your sexual quality. So you can your genetic quality. So you can conspicuously advertise how you've got good genes. How do you do that? You do so with secondary sexual characteristics, and particularly pronounced secondary sexual characteristics, saying my genes are good enough that I can grow big tits or a big ass or whatever. And as you move, as the species reaches its carrying capacity for the ecology and selection is harsher, then the environment is predictable and harsh, and the species starts to compete against each other. How do they do that? Well, they start moving away from investment in sex and towards investment in nurture and in adapting to the environment, in quality over quantity. And once that happens, of course, then you have to start investing in the female for the offspring to survive and have few of them and invest a great deal in them. So you want to make sure they're yours, and therefore what the woman looks like starts to become less important, and what her mind is like starts to become more important, because you want a woman who is going to be cooperative and is going to be a good mother and is going to not cuckold you, which is most important, of course. And she's probably going to be religious, which is a good marker of someone you can trust. It's probably what it's been selected for, actually. Probably why I had this idea when I was at university: Christian women are sexy. Religious women seem sexy, and I always wondered, why is it? Why are these religious women sexy? Is it this forbidden fruit dimension to it? What is it about them that's sexy? And part of it, I think, is that we are probably selected as men to be sexually attracted to religiousness, because those women are the women who you can trust, who you can invest in, who are the wives rather than the whores, if you like. And also probably because it's normal genetically it's a fact that they have more symmetrical faces than atheist women. But so you've got a limited amount of biogenetic resources, and therefore you invest in the mind. And therefore the woman invests less in advertising her genes and more in her mind, and therefore her boobs become flatter, there's less selection for big tits and so on. And this really is the case, that these women that have big boobs and big asses are more sociosexual. They're higher in extroversion, they're lower in agreeableness, they're lower in conscientiousness, they're higher in mental instability. They're everything you'd expect in an unstable ecology. Exactly that. And these women who are flat-chested and so on are agreeable and conscientious and introverted, so not risk-taking, that means, and mentally stable. So yeah, I mean, that's one example of many in the book of the kind of thing we're talking about. But there's on every level, even the nature of your hair, a great deal can be judged from appearance. Accurate intelligence can be judged very successfully from appearance. If you think that an example of a genetically low intelligence person would be someone with Down syndrome, and that's correlated with having a wide face, small nose, narrow eyes, very narrow, very pronounced, okay, and so on. And these factors, in a less pronounced way, are correlated with lower IQ that's low in a less pronounced way, which makes sense, really. And equally, if you look at people that have fetal alcohol syndrome, again, you get very similar features, and these are correlated with low intelligence. So you can, you really can judge people very successfully by what they look like. It's a sort of a taboo thing, but I'm afraid it's true. I mean, I'm sure we three of us that can see each other's faces have all been doing it all evening on some unconscious level. Yeah. Although we do it unconsciously. My point is, the data's there. We can do it consciously. I think that's fascinating. But anyway, your woman that you dated, 27.
Oh, she had F-cup breasts naturally, and she was a great lover, as you described. And when I moved on from her to an A-cup woman, because I thought the A-cup woman was more likely to have a stable long-term relationship with. And when I did that, the F-cup woman just completely blew her stack, wrote letters to my parents denouncing me. She just tried to create as much havoc in my life as possible. And when I talked to her 15 years later, she said that everybody she dated after me was a felon. So she just lived up to everything you talked about. Also, I wrote about the porn industry for about 12 years, where there are a lot of naturally busty women who tended to be low IQ, impulsive, not exactly great mother types. In general, I've kind of noticed that women who are hookers don't tend to make good wives and mothers.
There was a study in China where they had faces, and they were able to successfully rate criminality based on this. And it was the people that had asymmetrical faces and eyes that were sort of unnaturally close together that were more likely to be criminal. And this makes sense because if we're selected to be symmetrical, then being symmetrical will be associated with normal genes, as it were, and so any deviation from that should be associated with things that would be selected against. And if you have a, let's say, a religion that holds you together and says that this is just, then that's fine, and people won't question it as much. And if you have a society where everyone's relatively equal, then it's kind of acceptable as well. But if the gene pool is quite small, then again they're one big family, so it's relatively acceptable as well because you're one big family, right? But once those things are, and therefore socioeconomic differences in Finland, let's say, which is a small gene pool, and where the differences are relatively small, are not really pronounced, and there isn't much of this jealousy, or Iceland or whatever. In England, there's more so. And in a multiracial society, it's then particularly pronounced because they're so genetically different. And Kierkegaard looked at this as well, and therefore the social differences in somewhere like Brazil become absolutely huge. So because they're so genetically different, and therefore the jealousy becomes very, very intense. And that's kind of what I'd be more inclined to, how I sort of summarized it, I think, really. That's why, like in America, a lot of states in America, like Utah, I've been to Utah, and Utah is, everyone seems to get along there. There's not any problems in Utah. But if you go to somewhere like in the South, like, I don't know, Tennessee or South Carolina, where it's much more mixed, then it seems to be a much more tense atmosphere.